The New York Times, on August 25, 1929, had a chance to go to the stateroom of Captain George Pietsch and see what he had to say about his recent misadventure. It was 2 a.m, but faced with reporter questions, the New York Times reported, quote, Captain Pietsch smiled, shrugged his shoulders, and replied, "I'm 25 years on sea, yes? We sailors are not afraid. Once, twice, 3 times I went down in the war, but I am not dead, yes? We were castaways, but we were afraid of nothing." He insisted that there was no disorder, no scrambling for the boats.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Kimistan Falls Apart.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Kimistan had had several identities and nationalities over her 58-year-long career. She was originally built in Liverpool for the Booth Line in 1871 for the South America trade, and had sailed under the name the Lisbonense. The 1,661-ton iron-hulled screw steamship had also at one point sailed under the name Joseph Vaccaro, and was listed as having sailed under the flags of Norway, Honduras, and Germany over the years. The newspapers would later refer to the Kimistan as a banana boat, looking to her last owners, the Cuyamel Fruit Company of Honduras, who had acquired the ship in 1915. It was the Cuyamel Fruit Company that had given her the final name under which she sailed, the Kimistan. The aging Kimistan was eventually deemed to be too old and outdated for the role. She had an iron hull instead of a steel one, no wireless, had not been fitted for oil fuel, and had no electric lights. It simply would not be worthwhile to invest any money into modernizing the Kimistan, and she was taken out of service by the fruit company. She would eventually find a new owner 3 years after being taken out of service in the German Lloyd Company after a dry dock inspection in New Orleans. The dry dock inspection seems to have been an attempt to ensure that the Kimistan would be capable of making her final voyage, since the German Lloyd Company had no intention of keeping the vessel for long. They loaded her with scrap iron and declared her destination to be a scrapyard in Genoa, but it was a voyage that the aging ship was expected to be able to make under her own power. It would later be claimed that finding a captain and crew for the Kimistan had proved to be difficult, though these were facts that the owners would debate. It was true that Captain Vise, who originally took command of the ship in New Orleans, left the vessel in Norfolk. The German Lloyd Company would say that this was by prearrangement, but it was true that Captain Vise had come from Germany to take command of the Kimistan, and had then accepted a different post almost as soon as he landed in New York, before he ever reached the Kimistan. The German Lloyd Company had agreed that he could be released from his post if he brought the Kimistan from New Orleans to Norfolk before he took his new command. Rumor had it that about a dozen members of the crew had also abandoned the ship in Norfolk after the voyage from New Orleans, and these were rumors that the company did not address. The crew that would depart on the vessel headed for Genoa was described as being truly international. The nationalities of most of the crew were not mentioned, with the exception of the cooks. One of the cooks was American, the other cook was Australian, and reportedly had spent years in Hollywood playing small roles before getting the urge to wander again and signing aboard. At least some of the crew told the Lookout magazine that the reason they had joined the crew was because they needed a way back to return to Europe, and, therefore, closer to home, and the Kimistan was an available berth. There was one final inspection by her owners in Norfolk, where the ship was again given a clean bill of health for the voyage. Then Captain Pietsch took the place of the departing Captain Wiese in Norfolk, and the ship began her voyage on August 14th to head to Genoa to be scrapped. It did not seem as though the ship was in any danger as she departed. The weather was calm and good, with no storms on the horizon, and this would hold true for their entire voyage, though the voyage was much shorter than anyone could have predicted. None of the crew seems to have had illusions about the condition that the Kimistan was in. Jorgensen, the second mate, reported that she was rusted so thin that he could poke his hand through. Jorgensen was described as a large man, but not to the extent that he could punch through iron. So, provided he was not exaggerating, one does have to question the inspections that the Kimistan went through before her departure. Captain Pietsch did later insist that the ship had seemed completely capable of making the journey to Genoa, and that he would not have agreed to the voyage if he had thought otherwise. There would be nothing noteworthy during the voyage until they were about 800 miles off the coast of Delaware. First Officer Zeppelin was sick, but it did not seem to impact the day-to-day operations of the ship. The seas were still perfectly calm on the afternoon of August 18th when water suddenly began to rush into the ship. The exact reason for the water coming in would be a matter of disagreement between the crew members. Captain Pietsch would say that one of her plates dropped out of her bottom. Second mate Jorgensen would say that a rusted spot in her hull had given out. Some of the other crew members simply said that the ship had simply lain down and died, or gone to pieces under them. There really was no other way to explain a ship sailing through calm conditions, suddenly taking on large amounts of water. For 15 hours, the crew tried their best to keep the ship afloat and stop the inrushing waters. They had no radio with which to call for help, so they were forced to do their best on their own. Eventually, the rising water would put out the engine fires, however, and the additional weight on the water began to cause her other plates to buckle. It was beginning to be increasingly clear that the Kimistan was beyond all hope of saving. With this, the crew turned their attention to trying to signal for assistance, since they were in a major shipping lane. They started with flares, but when those did not get results, they then built a large fire on the forecastle head out of anything they could find to burn. Mattresses, chairs, planks, old clothing, and general garbage were all piled high and set alight in the hopes that it would attract the attention of another vessel. It did not. A few hours after midnight on the 19th of August, Captain Pietsch gathered the crew together and told them that they were going to have to abandon ship. There was no saving the Kimistan, and no ships had come to render aid. They needed to prepare to take to the boats. Captain Pietsch would later brag that there had been no panic or fear among the 26-member crew. Like Captain Pietsch, some of them would later tell the newspapers that this had not been their first shipwreck. The 2 lifeboats on the Kimistan were loaded with food, water, and the men's duffel bags of personal property. Since the first mate was sick, second mate Jorgensen took command of the second lifeboat, and with his group also went the ship's phonograph and records. Before the men left the ship, they stomped out the blaze that had been their last hope of being pulled from the sinking Kimistan by a passing vessel. Around 4 a.m. of August 19th, the crew of the Kimistan abandoned ship. For 3 days, the men of the 2 boats would manage to keep close to one another. They had rigged their sails and began to travel to the north, hoping that they would be able to stick to the Atlantic shipping lanes and be seen that way. Captain Pietsch would say that, worst came to worst, they were intending to head to Sable Island. The mood in the boats was considered generally jolly. The phonograph kept up a steady medley of American jazz music, and the men sang, joked, and told stories to keep up their spirits. On the morning of the 21st of August, the boats were separated, however, and no longer certain where the other one was. The wind was getting a little stronger, and the waves were getting a little choppier. Captain Benson, captain of the dollar-line ship, the President Harrison, was told by his third mate that there was a small sailboat in the water at 3:45 in the afternoon of the 21st. Knowing that a small sailboat was likely to be castaways, Captain Benson immediately ordered that the President Harrison change course to investigate. He was not to know that another small boat was watching them. The boat that the third mate had spotted was that of second mate Jorgensen, but not far off was the boat under the command of Captain Pietsch, who watched as the Harrison changed course and got further from them. At 4:30, second mate Jorgensen and the 12 men who had been in the boat with him were standing on board the President Harrison telling their story of shipwreck. They were going to go in search of the other lifeboat, but before they could even bring all of the stuff from lifeboat number 1 on board the President Harrison, lifeboat number 2 had come into view at their stern. This crew was also rescued, and both lifeboats were scuttled. Unlike the Kimistan, the President Harrison did have a wireless, and they sent ahead the news of their rescue and the loss of the Kimistan, while they headed to New York with the shipwrecked crew. There would be one last sighting of the Kimistan. The Yalsea sighted the Kimistan before any word was heard from the castaways, and therefore the abandonment of the ship was still unknown. The Kimistan was entirely engulfed in flames. Thinking that no survivors could possibly be on board her still, the Yalsea circled the ship several times in progressively larger circles, hoping that maybe they would find people in boats, but they did not. They finally continued their voyage after radioing to the United States Coast Guard that the Kimistan was in the middle of shipping lanes and posed a risk to navigation. Several destroyers were dispatched to sink the Kimistan, but by the time they reached her reported position, there was no ship there. Presumably, the Kimistan had finally given up the fight against the rushing water and sunk, effectively putting an end to the fire that could have been a danger to other ships. Once they reached New York, Captain Pietsch told reporters that he was very puzzled to hear that the ship had caught fire, that they had done what they could to stamp out the embers, and he believed that the fire that they had lit was entirely out. Everyone could only conclude that some embers had somehow survived and eventually taken hold, making a dramatic last vision of the Kimistan for those who had come across her. The newspapers took a large interest in the story of the men who had abandoned the ship. They made an unusual sight for people who had been shipwrecked. They had been able to bring their own clothing and other belongings off the ship when they departed her, and to face the newspaper reporters, the crew dressed nicely. A far cry from the rough-looking castaways the newspapers had expected. They were all in good health with the exception of the first mate, who had already been sick before the ship had started sinking, and the worst that could be said was that they were all tired after 3 days crammed in boats. Before they left the President Harrison, Captain Pietsch presented Captain Benson with the ship's compass they had used in the boat as a gift for his timely rescue. From the President Harrison, the crew of the Kimistan headed for Seamen's Church Institute, where they were housed until they could settle the matter of pay for their shortened voyage. On the 28th of August, it was reported that the crew had indeed been paid off after an investigation into the loss of the Kimistan by the German consulate. The consulate also announced that they would be helping the crew find employment on other ships so that they would not suffer from the loss of the Kimistan. They declined to answer any questions about the findings of the inquiry, and it can only be presumed that they found the same as everyone else did, that the Kimistan was simply too old and worn out for the voyage that she was undertaking. Since she had not been insured, there was no reason to suspect insurance fraud, though underwriters still took an interest since there had been other cases where ships had been insured and in similar condition. It was suspected by the insurance community that at least part of the problem had been the ship's cargo of scrap iron, which they believed to have put undue strain on the aging ship. Captain Benson was credited at the end of 1929 with having saved 28 lives. There had been the 26 crew members of the Kimistan. With the addition of Captain Pietsch, that made 27 lives in total. Then, later in the year, he received a message from the Norwegian oil tanker, the Anatina, while the President Harrison was traveling between Honolulu and Kobe. The message said that one of their sailors was in need of immediate operation. Captain Benson arranged for his ship to meet with the tanker, brought the sailor on board the President Harrison, and had his ship's surgeon do the operation, saving the sailor's life. His willingness to aid others at sea and divert and delay his own vessel when faced with those in need would receive praise from the Merchant Marine Bulletin, which considered 28 lives saved in 1 year a very respectable number. For more information, please see the Ogden Standard Examiner from August 25, 1929, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.